Chapter 2. There was no kindness behind their smiles. Their words were polite and their expressions pleasant, but Edward Knox couldn't look them in the eyes. If he hadn't been able to tell by their large size, with their cheap ready-made suits doing nothing to hide their heavily muscled frames, the emptiness of their gazes gave them away. They were Whitey Chester's men. They were there to do a job, and nothing Edward Knox could say would change that. They had been waiting for him in his kitchen when he got home from work. With their size and impatient manner, they dominated the compact kitchen of Knox's small and tidy house. Small and tidy, just the right size for Knox and his wife, with a bright white kitchen just barely large enough for sink and stove and icebox, and a little breakfast nook across the way. Somehow, these coarse men in their dark suits seemed too large to fit in such a cozy space. The back door was open. Knox imagined the lock had been forced. Somehow, it didn't seem proper to examine the damage while the two men were here. At least his wife was nowhere around. He guessed he should thank the Lord for small favors. No matter what these two wanted to do, maybe he could at least protect his beloved Eleanor for a little while longer. The men had told Knox to sit, and he thought it best not to argue. They then proceeded to quickly, politely, and perhaps a bit too eagerly describe what was going to happen if he didn't pay. If he didn't pay, he couldn't even begin to find that kind of money. If only he could get these men to understand. He could hear the desperation in his own voice as he tried to reason with them. But how can I pay you if you break my hand? The slightly larger of the two men, who had said that his name was Bert, smiled at his objection. I'm glad you asked, Mr. Knox. He glanced at his co-worker, who hardly spoke at all. From the lack of introduction, apparently didn't have a name either. See, Bert continued, Mr. Chester wants you to understand the nature of our business. Breaking your hand might be unfortunate for all concerned. He paused, and his nameless friend nodded sadly. But it may also be necessary, Bert continued. His friend's nod became even more vigorous. That kind of loss here, as unfortunate as it may be, will send a real message to our other customers. You might not be able to pay, but others will. Yeah, his friend agreed. Knox didn't like the enthusiasm he heard in that single word. Bert slapped Knox's shoulders gently, like they were a couple of old pals. Hey, you'll find a way to pay. It was Bert's turn to nod at his nameless friend. If not, we'll break your other hand, and then both your legs. His friend's grin got bigger with every passing word. Knox half expected the big man to giggle. In comparison, Bert's smile was the very picture of restraint. And when we're done with you, we'll start on your wife. Oh no, they could do what they wanted to Knox, but he couldn't allow anything to happen to Eleanor. He looked away from the two bruisers, afraid to show too much emotion. Mr. Knox, when you borrow money from Mr. Chester and don't pay on time, well, it can turn into a lifetime commitment. Bert sighed. If you're gonna sell pencils on the street corner, you're gonna raise the money. His friend opened his mouth to agree. We're gonna be around for a long, long time. This all seemed a little unreal. Knox had always given his wife the finest things he could afford, and sometimes even things he couldn't quite afford. Perhaps lately, with his wife's delicate nature and the small illness that seemed to come on both of them as they grew older, he had spent a little bit too much on his wife's happiness. Somehow, he had found himself thousands of dollars in debt. He had tried the ponies to solve his problems, but not a single horse had come in, and the money he'd borrowed from the company payroll was sure to be missed any day. Knox hadn't even wanted to begin to think about what might happen if that discrepancy was discovered. There had been nothing left but to float a little short-term loan. The fellows down at the speakeasy told him about Mr. Chester, His rates were a little high, but he didn't ask any questions. That suited Knox just fine. He would get the money back into the payroll account with a minimum of fuss. After all, his fortunes would be turning around any day. But his luck hadn't gotten no better. The horses were just as slow, and he didn't dare touch the payroll again. Knox had heard these gentlemen could be a little insistent about repayment, but he never imagined it would be anything like this. The mostly silent partner reached out towards Knox. His fingers snapped as if hungry for Knox's hand. "Just a few hours," Knox heard himself say. Bert shook his head slowly. "Mr. Knox, you're a nice old geezer, but we spent too much time with you already." His voice took on a tired tone, as if he'd said these words too many times before. "We're getting behind in our other obligations." Other obligations? Knox wondered how many hands they broke on an average day. "We need a reason," the nameless friend added, his own hand an inch away from closing around Knox's wrist, "or we do it now." Reason. Knox felt a panic well up inside him. He couldn't think of the reason why he was here, or the reason why these men would break his hands. What was the reason for anything? He pulled his hands back, hugging them close to his suit jacket. He felt the envelope in his pocket. Oh, yes! He quickly pulled the invitation free. "Here's where the money's coming from, in just a few more hours." He opened the envelope and offered Bert the registered letter he'd received at his office earlier in the day. "Maybe we can just break a finger," the nameless friend had said hopefully. "You can still do most anything with a broken finger." But Bert took the letter from Knox and opened it. He seemed to read it all in a single glance. Bert whistled. "The richest man in town, huh?" It was Knox's turn to nod, his head bobbing up and down so quickly it threatened to make him dizzy. "Yes, old Mr. Stahl. He has nothing to do with his money now that his toy shop is closed, and you can see he thinks highly of me." Bert scowled at that. The other man looked back to Bert as if waiting for some sign that it was time to break things. "I have more than just his ear," Knox added quickly. "Mr. Stoff is very interested in my plans, very interested and very rich." Bert's frown deepened, as if it hurt to make this kind of decision. "Well, maybe Mr. Chester can give you a little more time after all." "We hate to have unhappy customers," the other man added, but he kept staring at Knox's hands. Knox continued to nod. Maybe Stoff would float him a loan. If not, he had heard the house was full of antiques. Maybe he could manage to borrow one or two of those, too. He offered to show the two men the door. "No thanks," Bert answered. "We already found it once." "We'll be seeing you, Mr. Knox," his friend added, "right after the party." With that, they were gone. Knox clutched the invitation and the short personal note that had accompanied it, as if it was the only thing in the world that might keep him whole and healthy, which it was. He was still sitting at the kitchen table when his wife appeared half an hour later, with a story about how she had received a message from her Uncle Phil to meet her at the drugstore downtown. Knox had always urged Eleanor to be nice to Uncle Phil. He was her one relative with money. Except her uncle had never sent any such message. He hadn't been at the drugstore, and when Eleanor had called his house, the cook had said that he was out of town. Knox guessed that little deception had been a gift from Bert and his friend to get Eleanor out of the way. He was glad they had at least spared her that unpleasantness. But he couldn't let his wife see how upset he'd become. She depended upon him so. He looked down at the invitation, still cradled in his hands. "Dear," he began, looking up at her with his best smile. "Something happened today. Something that I think might be very rewarding." He handed her the invitation. She screamed when she touched the envelope, throwing it to the floor as if it burned her hand. Knox jumped from the chair and rushed to her side. "Dear," he asked. She should have been pleased, perhaps overjoyed. He had never expected a reaction like this. "Oh, Edward, I don't know." She stared down at the envelope, her arms folded before her chest as if she might ward off a chill. "There was something about where this has been. Who's touched the paper?" She paused, as if the resonance had taken her words away. Knox took her in his arms. She started to cry. Eleanor was such a sensitive woman. This day, with the false errand, must have been very trying for her. She was having one of her spells, as she called them. They always made her very emotional. Knox could never quite understand them. He looked down at the white envelope, very bright against the dull brown linoleum of their kitchen floor. It was only a party. What could his wife have possibly felt just by touching an envelope? Edward Knox sighed. It had been a very trying day